Right, this is the response that I sent in the Bullying and Harassment Investigation conducted by Andy Brown to the witness statement of Paul Browning. I obviously haven't answered every single number there, but these are the responses in numeric order to the questions asked, if I bothered to respond at all. Right, so number 19, Paul Browning claims that he has, and I quote, never spoken to him, that's John O'Shea, verbally, unquote. But John O'Shea's statement at number 72 says that John O'Shea phoned Paul Browning before I left Norwich. Paul Browning states that he doesn't know what John O'Shea looks like, yet Paul Browning told me himself one morning that he had met, and I quote, an old mate of yours, unquote. When I asked him who that was, he said, John O'Shea. To which I replied, and I quote, that must have been nice for you, end quote, as I recall, which is all that was said in that conversation. That's actually not all that was said. I have to add that what he said to me right after that was, yeah, not my kind of bloke. But anyway, that's not in this complaint. Number 21. I did not have a, quote, checkered past, end quote, at all at Ipswich, nor specifically with John O'Shea, as was judged by the tribunal. And I find this comment derogatory and disparaging. Paul Browning knows about my complaint because he sat in as a note taker at my Stage 2 grievance meeting on the 23rd of October 2013, which was very inappropriate because it clearly biased my new line manager against me, as he heard all the details of my complaints, and this is a breach of confidentiality. I asked Ian Longman, which is the union rep, if I swore in that meeting, and he said I did not. If I swore at all, it's because of the stress that I have been going through since last July over this matter, and also because I have Asperger syndrome and get easily stressed in new situations and have great difficulty adjusting to change. I used to swear every day when preparing my delivery, especially just before I went out, because I had manual dexterity problems related to my disabilities and was always late getting out of the office. Furthermore, many of my colleagues swore regularly and loudly, as well as belching and farting and making derogatory comments about women amounting to sexual harassment. So I hardly think Paul Browning can pretend he was offended or unused to such language, and Paul Browning is obviously trying to discredit me. Nor does this swearing, if it occurred in any conversation about John O'Shea, imply anything other than that I was very stressed when describing this case, and I was on medication and still am, 2 years later, for the stress and depression caused to me because of this case. Number 23. The notes appear to have two mistakes here with the initials J-O in the first two sentences. As stated above, Paul Browning sat in on that grievance meeting as note taker, which is very inappropriate and has clearly biased my new line manager against me, and this is a breach of confidentiality. 24. As nobody at Halesworth probably knew John O'Shea, what would be my motive in trying to harm his reputation? I deny that I was trying to harm John O'Shea's reputation. Number 25. As I have already sent Andy Brown evidence that shows Paul Browning has lied, which will be discussed below, I hardly think his opinion about my intentions is relevant. To suggest that I was giving him any kind of, quote, warning, unquote, is ridiculous exaggeration. I used to think Paul Browning was all right, and that I I've missed the word liked, but it should be in there, and that I liked him and did not wish to get him into trouble. I do not believe that Paul Browning was ever intimidated by me, but if he was, he would be aware as a manager that this would have been proper to the bullying and harassment procedure, and he would have made a complaint. I believe this is further defamation of my character by Paul Browning. If any meeting between myself and Paul Browning was in a room on our own, that was by his choosing. As for the comment, quote, I felt that it was also a warning that if I took him above the normal daily delivery, I would be on the end of these complaints as well, unquote. This is another fabrication. I had more than one conversation with management about booking overtime, and they expected me to work over my time because they would not make reasonable adjustments for my disabilities, but they expected me not to book overtime or get paid for it, which caused issues, and Ian Longman, CWU representative, had to become involved. This was arguably a separate issue to my issues at Norwich, and it is immaterial to the question. Number 27. As most people at Halesworth DO, that's delivery office, ostracised me, which is proper to the bullying and harassment procedure, I believe this answer is highly unlikely. 29. Again, Paul Browning knows about my complaint because he sat in as a note taker at my Stage 2 grievance meeting on the 23rd of October 2013. Which was very inappropriate because it clearly biased my new line manager against me, and this is a breach of confidentiality, as he heard all the details of my complaints and is now using, I'm missing the word, them against me. Number 31. If John O'Shea said, and I quote, nothing, end quote, about me, it must have been a very short and pointless telephone conversation John O'Shea and Paul Browning had. A conversation which John O'Shea has admitted in his statement at number 72, which was allegedly about me transferring to Paul Browning's office. Number 35. You will note that Paul Browning acknowledges my actual reasons for leaving Norwich, although I do not accept that these were the, quote, exact, unquote, words I used. The job I went for and didn't get was not a world-class male's job, although, again, Paul Browning heard all the details of my complaints at the Stage 2 grievance meeting on the 23rd of October 2013, at which he should not have been present in, as it has clearly biased him, and again, this is a breach of confidentiality. 36. The question asks, quote, what conversation did you, PB, in square brackets, have with J.O. about that, end quotes. Number 37. Paul Browning replies, quote, interaction along the lines of, JF probably was the worst delivery postman I have ever had work for me. He has disabilities and couldn't pick up deliveries, end quote. The comments of Paul Browning herein are utterly offensive and amount to harassment, and this once again demonstrates management's attitude towards disabled employees to be the same as in my complaint against John O'Shea at Norwich. Paul Browning stated previously, number 19, that he had never spoken to John O'Shea verbally, and he has not provided this in emails, as he deleted them by his own admission, number 43. Furthermore, he admits it at number 43 is what I'm saying. Furthermore, quote, interaction, unquote, is more than one way, which means that Paul Browning and John O'Shea did discuss it, contrary to what is acknowledged by both parties. For the record, management at Halesworth failed to make reasonable adjustments for me when requested, which has been the subject of a formal grievance, by which process I was returned to Norwich via Simon Stepney, not Tim Kay. Paul Browning goes on to say, quote, John O'Shea said there weren't any duties as he was trying to cut costs and James Fisk's duty was no longer available, end quote. This statement concurs with the statement of John O'Shea, Paul Hayes and Pat Parsons and the emails supplied in this investigation. However, it is not true that my job no longer existed, it was merely hidden. This job, Duty 315, still exists now, although I have not been assigned it since my return to Norwich, in contravention of the agreement between Tim Kay, Dennis King and myself made on the 28th of January 2014. And it was still not on the duty signing on sheets last week before I went sick. Paul Browning goes on to state that Ian Longman came to see him, although Ian Longman was not called as a witness in this investigation. I went sick in November 2013 after 2 incidents of bullying and harassment and intimidation from a colleague, despite telling Paul Browning after the first incident about this, and management deciding it was, and I quote, a case of handbags, end quote. In both cases, this was related to my disabilities and was therefore disability discrimination. 39. Although Paul Browning states that John O'Shea's tone was precise, Paul Browning doesn't seem to know how many emails there were at first. As first, he states, quote, 1 or 2 emails, end quote. Then he states, quote, designed to finish the conversation off in 1 email, end quote, although I've left the quote marks out. 41. Paul Browning seems to know which email is described here, but see below at number 49. Number 43. Paul Browning denies his comments alluding to the questionable email and goes on to admit deleting the evidence. I'll say that again. And goes on to admit deleting the evidence. When asked the question again, Paul Browning denies his comments about this email again and denies that John O'Shea ever, quote, put in an email or hinted along those lines, end quote. I have supplied Andy Brown with a full transcript of the recorded conversation in which Paul Browning told me this on the 7th of November 2013. Paul Browning admits John O'Shea, quote, has always seemed in the email conversations, plural, he was not willing to take him, JF, back, end quote. Note the use of the plural conversations, indicating more than one conversation, and the word willing, indicating that it was willful on the part of John O'Shea. Whatever was in the email, Paul Browning deleted the evidence. If Paul Browning was telling the truth about this email when he first told me about it, then John O'Shea has supplied an email that has been edited or has not supplied the email in question. Either way, I believe this is gross misconduct. Number 47. Paul Browning claims he doesn't remember me asking to see the email in question, but turns to something irrelevant to the question. Again, he claims he can't remember me asking to see the email in question. Paul Browning goes on to denigrate me by saying, quote, if he did see it, knowing JF, he would have taken a picture of it. I think this is all one statement here. In the grievance meeting, which he should not have been at, that's my aside, JF was asked if he recorded things, and he said he did, and would take pictures if necessary, end quote. That's a fucking lie. For the record, John Kirk asked me in that meeting about why I record things, and I explained about my learning difficulties, and how I used the dictaphone throughout my degree. At no time did I ever say I, quote, would take pictures if necessary, end quote, but I've missed it. So this is an absolute lie, and Paul Browning is defaming me again. 49. Paul Browning evades the question and feigns ignorance about the questionable email, despite knowing which one is referred to earlier, as above, number 41. 51. Paul Browning states, quote, I can honestly say there were lots and lots of conversations between me and JF, end quote. At most, there were several conversations between us, as Paul Browning was hardly ever in the office, to my knowledge, and it was supervised by a PhD, which stands for Postman Higher Grade, named Dale Clark. Once again, Paul Browning cannot remember me ever asking to see the dubious email. The transcript I supplied to Andy Brown very clearly confirms that I did ask, and Paul Browning stated, quote, you get a copy, I get my P45, end quote. Listen to the recording that's up on YouTube. Number 53. Of course I had, quote, previous issues, end quote, with John O'Shea. I was in the process of an ongoing complaint against him about bullying and harassment, intimidation, victimisation, and disability discrimination, etc., which HRSC, which is the Human Resources Service Centre, refused to acknowledge as such and pushed through the grievance procedure against my wishes and the meaning of my complaints. Regarding Paul Browning's statement, quote, I have never come across anyone in Royal Mail who seemed so against a senior manager, end quote. The fact that he is a, quote, senior manager, end quote, is irrelevant. If he were God himself and I had those issues with him, I would still make the complaints and expect them to be dealt with. Regarding the comment about, quote, you were aware within the first 10 minutes of walking through the door that he didn't like J.O., end quote. This is exaggeration designed to discredit me, and I do not have to like John O'Shea. Regarding the sentence, quote, to be honest, I am relieved he doesn't work in Halesworth anymore because his conditions, that's my disabilities, make it hard for him and me, end quote. This is harassment on the grounds of my disabilities. Once again, Paul Browning uses the words, quote, to be honest, end quote, yet in the transcript supplied to Andy Brown and mentioned above, Paul Browning states, quote, for my well-being, I would like you to stay, to be honest, to be fair, end quote. This raises the question, despite how many times he uses the word, does Paul Browning even know what, quote, honest, quote, end quote, means? And to sort of sum up my feelings here, I believe the grievance and bullying harassment complaints I raised at Halesworth Delivery Office, together with all of the long-term sickness I sustained, would account for Paul Browning's witness statement being such a personal attack, and it is little more than a tissue of lies and fabrication intended to denigrate me, which is again bullying and harassment. In allowing me to be bullied and harassed, and in failing to make reasonable adjustments in consideration of my disabilities while I was at Halesworth Delivery Office, management failed in their duty of care, that's a legal duty of care, to me, both as an employee and as a disabled person, there's no as, and a disabled person, as I can prove with evidence. Paul Browning's disparaging witness statement is nothing less than victimisation. I believe that there was an arrangement between Paul Browning and John O'Shea that began before Paul Browning contacted me on the 24th of June 2013. and everything that happened to me at Halesworth was contrived, and this was an attempt to cover up a deliberate persecution which was designed to make me leave the business. For the record, I was offered the chance by Andrew Chitty, in brackets, deputy manager at Halesworth, close brackets, to see the questionable email referred to herein, but I declined because I did not wish to get Paul Browning in trouble at that time, because I thought he was an okay guy. That was an error of judgment on my part. Signed, James Fisk, 28th of June, 2013.